Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first week of a series on grief and loss. During this series, we hope that you will take some time to consider your own grief and the losses that you've felt. You know, during this pandemic that's lasted over 2 years, we've all experienced some form of grief and some form of loss, whether it's the loss of a loved one to the virus, or a loss of job security, a loss of financial security. Maybe it's the loss of normalcy or stability, things we thought we knew and having to lose those. Whatever your loss may be, we hope that you'll be intentional about thinking about that, not ignoring it, and being willing to share it with us. So what this series looks like is it's going to last for 6 weeks from now and through Easter. Each Wednesday morning you'll see one of these meditations posted, which is a summary or a meditation on a chapter in the book called The Smell of Rain on Dust, Grief and Praise by Martin Prechtel. Rather than have you buy this book and read it all, which I think you should do if you're interested, I'm going to briefly summarize and meditate on some of the chapters I found absolutely compelling around grief and praise. And then on Sundays after church, I invite you to join us either at the St. Peter's building or online via Zoom for a small group discussion on what was shared in that week's meditation and to contemplate our own grief and our own loss. I want to name that everyone is comfortable to share what they're willing to share, but no one's compelled to share to be a part of the group. We know that grief is a difficult emotional state to go through, but we really believe that this book informs us and science informs us that sharing and processing your grief openly and honestly helps your grief to come full circle into praise. So the first chapter of this book is entitled Grief is a Shameless Dreamer. Martin Prechtel is a Native American theologian and author who writes from a space that's much different than most of us that come from a white colonial mindset would think of. So I invite you, as you listen or as you read, to take yourself out of that state of being and move into more of a naturalist and Native American mindset that believes that all things have life and power and voice and emotion, everything from people and humans to trees and rocks and the sea and the like. And that will, I think, help you center into that state of being and better understand what Martin is trying to convey, because he puts grief into a personality, as if grief were a living person for us that has ways of moving and being. And so if you think of it in that way, it will really help you connect with the summary of the text. I want to start off by briefly going through a couple of bullet points. The first chapter is only 3 pages, and it has mainly just bulleted points of what grief is and what grief is not. And it sets the tone for the rest of the chapter. So I want to spend some time there, but I won't read the whole thing. He opens the chapter by saying this very brief but powerful phrase: grief is natural. And I really don't think that there could be any more said for that. You know, oftentimes we think about grief as something that is shameful, something that we're going through after a loss and we should just get over it. But Martin encourages us in this opening line that grief is as natural as breathing. It's as natural as going to the bathroom or eating or anything you might do in your day-to-day life that you have to do in order to survive. It is a natural process. He also says that grieving is necessary. So not only do we have to do it in order to live, it is required of us. To grieve is natural, and to grieve is necessary. Grieving should never be avoided or postponed, Martin tells us. What he's saying in those lines is that grieving should not ever be halted or put on pause. When we're grieving a loss, we need to grieve it immediately. In this pandemic, that's not been something that's been open to all of us, is being able to grieve immediately. When the pandemic first started, a lot of people had to postpone funeral ceremonies because they couldn't gather, or they had to postpone them to get people from in out of town, or to learn how to Zoom funerals. And so we postponed a lot of our grief, and we had to survive the pandemic first and really treat our grief secondly. And I think Martin would say that that is not a healthy way to grieve. The next thing Martin says that I think is important here is he says that grief can never be outrun or simply thought away. Again, that goes back to that thought that grief cannot be postponed or avoided. We can't outrun our grief, and we can't simply think it away. So a lot of us in the West think that if we can just simply think something, we can will it into being. If we just think hard enough, if we reason hard enough, if we spend time in our head long enough, we will get over this grief. We will somehow get past the feelings that grief brings if we just think hard enough. And I think what Martin is saying is that we can't do that. Grief is not something that we can get away from. If we are feeling grief, it's something we're going to be feeling. The only choice we have is to do it in a healthy way or a not healthy way. The next thing that Martin compares grief to is he says that grief is a sacred art. What does that mean for us? That grief is sacred, first of all, or that grief is a sacred art? If grief is necessary and natural, we can't postpone it and we can't outrun it, then grief is us making sense of our loss. And how do we make sense of that loss? Well, some of us engage in funeral ceremonies. If you think about it, a funeral ceremony is one big piece of art. A funeral ceremony has songs and spoken word and memory shared and a sermon possibly, or scripture text from a book. So in reality, a funeral service is a art form. It's a way of processing and making sense of our loss. What are other ways we grieve? Well, there's a whole school of thought around grieving through art by creating works of art, whether that's painting or drawing or photography or music. Think about how much music comes from a place of great pain. Think about how much music is written after a breakup or a death, right? So grief is inherently an art form. So I invite you to think about this week, what are ways in which you grieve, and is there a way to grieve that loss with some form of art? Even if you don't think of yourself as an artist, what kind of art could you use to depict your grief? He says grief is the art behind all real art, meaning any art we go see on a wall, even if it's about, say, two children running through a playground. Well, what if we know that the artist lost a child during labor? That is a art piece informed by grief, but we as the viewer don't get that unless we know the artist's pain. It's the art behind all real art. Anything composed, anything written, anything drawn inherently comes from a place of grief and pain. Now, I think that this is really, really important, what Martin says here. Grief is not sorrow, though there are certainly stages of grieving that are sorrow-filled. Let me say that again. Grief is not sorrow, though there are certainly stages of grieving that are sorrow-filled. Real grieving refuses to remain in sorrow. So when Martin's saying that when we grieve, and we grieve properly and honestly, that we refuse to remain in that sorrow. He admits that there will be points in our grieving that have sorrow or sadness in them, but that we don't remain there if we're truly processing our grief. He says that grief is active. Grief is not something that we do passively or that we do alone, but rather that grief is something we do communally. Grieving is something that we do with action and purpose. Again, what would that mean for you to be grieving actively? I like what he says here. Grief is the sound of being alive. You know, when I think about my own loss, my uncle passed away. Actually, he was killed on his job site not long ago. And I think that I really understood what the sound of grief was when my grandmother was told, his mother. I don't think I could ever replicate that sound, and I don't think I'd ever want to hear that sound again. But by hearing that sound, that wailing cry, encompassing all of her emotions at that time, if grief had a sound, that was it. What is your grief sound? Can you remember it? Can you think back to what it sounded like? Have you ever heard it again? That's the sound of being alive, because you are grieving something that is no longer alive and you have to remain here. That is that sadness and anger, sometimes relief, that is coming out of you uncontrollably. That is the sound of grief, and that is the sound of being alive. Similar to what he said about sorrow, he says grief is not depression. A griever is not depressed. He says that depression comes from not being able to grieve, which converts our losses into violence. So what he's saying is that grief is not automatically depression. I think in this country we quickly assign some people to having depression or suffering from depression, or we medicate them for depression. And I'm not saying that depression isn't a real diagnosis, but I think that always associating depression with grief and normalizing it is not necessarily the same thing. Just because you're grieving doesn't mean you're depressed. And just because you're depressed doesn't mean you're grieving. If you're depressed, it means you haven't processed your grief in a healthy way. You've processed it in an unhealthy way. Whether by choice or by force, you have not processed that grief in a way that you have needed to, and thus you have repressed it, become depressed, and now you are acting it out in an unhealthy way. So then Martin goes on to sort of give us a narrative of who grief interacts with. If we think that grief is an embodied person, he gives us grief's best friend. He says that grief is the best friend of praise, because praise is a grandiose griever. What he's saying there is that grief and praise are best friends because praise is the ultimate griever. They're the best griever that's ever existed. Without both grief and praise, life is only hate and mediocrity. So if you think about that, grief and praise go hand in hand, because if we come to a funeral service or a memorial service or a celebration of life, we are in our state of grieving still. It hasn't stopped. It's not as if we have to be over our grief to get to the praise. Praise isn't the acceptance at the end of grief. Rather, grief and praise go hand in hand so that we can get through that journey together. When you think about a funeral service or a celebration of life or something in the like, we sing songs of praise. Songs like Amazing Grace or Great is Thy Faithfulness. Songs in which we are offering praise to God for the life that we have lost. And I think that that's really a real symbiotic